The final round of the SINQUEFIELD Cup was long and incredibly tense and had moments of high drama. Fabiano Caruana led the field by half a point, and he was the first into the clubhouse. He drew fairly quickly against Wesley So. So Caruana had 5.5 out of 9. That meant that the chasing pack could join him if they won their games. First of all, let's look at the game between Aronian and Grischuk. So if either one of them won, they could join Caruana in first place. Levon Aronian with the white pieces, two very exciting players, and this game lived up to everyone's hopes and expectations. So Grischuk gunning for first place. He's not playing something super solid. He's playing an old Indian, an unusual opening, not a King's Indian, but an old Indian. And this is a very old line he's playing. You can play with Bishop e7 here, but he went for e4. And this line is, well, nowadays a little bit unusual, but in the past has been played by, well, Bogolyubov, Keresh, some great names from the past. Now this knight can go to g5, h4, d2. Aronian played knight h4. So it looks a little bit unusual to have this knight at the side of the board, but it has potential, this piece. d5. So we've almost got a kind of French position with black having this French pawn structure. But this knight is slightly oddly placed, and the bishop is again slightly strangely placed. Bishop b4. Now it's important to eliminate this knight because soon queen b3 is coming, and also there's going to be pressure on black's center. So Aronian exchanged, and now queen b3 is quite a decent move here. It's been played before, but Aronian just attacked the pawn chain with f3. Okay, it's a very logical move. So Grischuk eliminated that knight and castles. So now we have a really tense position where white is trying to break down this center. If black can maintain control, he's doing pretty well. But it's a tough job because he's not very well developed. And white has a lot of pressure on the f-file, and bishop a3 comes to attack the rook. Now the rook moves away from f7. That is potentially risky. So there's potentially a lot of pressure, sometimes on this diagonal, sometimes on this diagonal, sometimes on the f-file. And knight f5 looks really menacing. Knight b6. But if black can get control here, that's pretty good. Knight d6. So first crunch moment in the game. If the rook moves, then white can exchange and now play an interesting move, c4. Now these pawns rolling forward, and if rook takes, we can take. Knight takes. So black sacks an exchange, but this knight has a decent position. Black has compensation. Probably white is better here. So instead of going in for that, Grischuk played knight c4. Now this is a very powerful sacrifice if white takes the rook. So for example, if knight takes rook, queen takes, so the knight is just on a beautiful square. Bishop comes back, and now e3 just locks down the position. And if you can't budge that knight from c4, this is wonderful for black. Well, let's just say superb compensation. Aronian spent a long time thinking here and exchanged. I should say also that Grischuk was investing a lot of time. Thing is, in this kind of situation, if black's position falls apart, if he can't maintain this central control, then black will just be blown off the board. So I'm not surprised that both players invested a lot of time here. Aronian exchanged on e4. Rather reminds me of a variation in the English with bishop b4. Anyway, we can discuss that another time. Queen c2, attacking the knight. If that knight falls back, then white will storm through the middle with e4. So it's essential that Grischuk maintains this blockade. And now white, I suppose the obvious way for white to try and play here is to play rook f4 to put more pressure on that knight. But then bishop f5 actually holds firm. If this second rook comes across, then that bishop will duck back. Actually, black is all right here. There's another way to go, is to play rook f3 and attack that knight from e3. And then bring the second rook up. But black is holding firm there as well. It's incredible. All the pieces, bar the bishop on a3, all the pieces concentrated on that knight there. But black seems to be all right. But Aronian had prepared an extraordinary move in this position. Clock times here were Aronian had 36 minutes. Grischuk had 15 minutes remaining. So 22 moves still to make till the time control. Or 23 actually. Aronian played rook takes pawn. An incredible sacrifice. Now, if queen takes, then white is the exchange down, but has wonderful compensation in the form of those two bishops. And once this bishop moves out of the way, then the e-pawn can advance. So king takes is essential. So at the moment, white is a whole rook down. If the king goes back to g8, then careful, there's going to be a mate on f8. Or king g6 doesn't look good, steps into a nasty pin. So bishop f5 is more or less forced, and after this at least white gets one piece back. So g6 holds that. Thing is, even after white sacrifices like this, black is still holding that knight on e4, still maintaining that blockade. So it's still not so easy for white to get things going. But here is where Aronian started to play some really tricky moves. Queen c1. It takes a lot of guts to play like this. There's no immediate payoff from this sacrifice. All you have is a little bit of initiative. You've opened the king to some extent, and you're hoping to somehow break in with the queen. But it's not simple. My machine tells me that rook e6 is the best move here, but very difficult to determine that during a game. Would you really want to allow this queen into h6? Grischuk played, to my eyes, a much more human move, a more natural move, stepping out of the pin and also covering the h6 square. So Aronian at least took that bishop back. So he's now only the exchange down. Well, that's enough. And now very hard to see how to make progress unless this knight is eliminated. That knight covering some key squares. And here rook takes would allow the queen in, followed by rook f5. And white certainly has enough compensation there. So pawn takes. And that means that the queen covers the g5 square, so preventing white's queen from checking. Queen f4. Now, very important that that bishop covers the f8 square, preventing the rook coming over. So white's initiative starting to look pretty threatening now. Grischuk makes room for his king on a light square. That's important. So means this bishop can't potentially get into attack. And now Aronian checked on c7. Maybe king f2 first of all is stronger, but it still doesn't guarantee white the advantage. Queen c7 well, also presents black with a few problems. But and here Grischuk stepped back with the king. In fact, he should step up the board. But such a move is very difficult to play. I mean, the calculation involved here is extraordinary. And Grischuk was running extremely short of time. This was his problem. I think Aronian basically saw how short Grischuk was on time, and that's when he decided to make this sacrifice. And it's a really good practical decision, because variations like this are impossible to calculate. How can one determine that this is actually good for black? Very, very difficult. So the king staggers out of the way and makes room for the rook to attack. But apparently black is all right here. But that is very, very hard to see. Black survives, and according to my machine, black has a clear advantage here. Still not obvious to my human eyes. Anyway, instead of that, Grischuk stepped back with the king. The problem with this is that the bishop slides in and manages to anchor itself on this beautiful square e5. Grischuk gives a check and plays rook g6. So that means that after this check, which happened, then the king comes to g8. So for the moment, black is holding. But this is king e3 is such a nice move from Aronian. I think this is a beautiful idea to bring the king up to e3, blockading that pawn. So it means that there's no e3, so the queen, black's queen, can't take part in some kind of counterattack. So wonderful square for the king. And now black has to be really careful. He should play b5. And, well, let's say if white's queen tries to move over, then queen e6 is still okay for black. H4 is interesting, but again, queen e6 is probably the best move. But white has full compensation here. This is basically, it's very, very difficult to quell white's initiative. But having said that, black should also be all right in this position. White can bring the king over to safety. There's no check here, and actually, yeah, white's king can hide here, and white will carry on. Very hard for black to actually free himself from white's pressure, but there's no forced win for white. So that's the position. King e3, b5 should be played. Instead, short of time, Grischuk played rook d8, which feels like a very natural move to make. You want to potentially block with the rook on d7 or possibly the queen. But in fact, after this, Aronian has a wonderful move, queen e7. And this leaves black in Zugzwang. The situation is hopeless. Black would like to play queen d7 to counter the queen, but then comes rook f8 and queen takes queen. And white now has a slow motion threat to advance the h-pawn, to just displace the rook. So this rook can't move away here because of queen g7 mate. It can't move up the board because there'll be rook f6. Basically, black can't move here. Grischuk tried b5, but I mean, obviously this has no real effect on the position. And now h4 just is enough to disturb black here. So if h5 blocking, then rook f5, you take and mate. So a5 from Grischuk, he can do nothing about this. h5, now if, as I said before, if the rook moves this way, then queen g7 is mate. The rook comes here, then rook f6. This is the game continuation. White is just going to take on h6. Grischuk played rook takes bishop, but that allows mate straight away. Rook g6 and queen g7 mate next turn. Just a fantastic game from Aronian. Real artistry there. Takes incredible guts to play rook takes pawn. But then my favourite bit of this was putting the king on e3. It's a masterpiece, this game. Really, really nice. Well, as Aronian said after the game, well, he quoted Larsen. He said, as Larsen said, when you take risks, you'll lose, you'll win, but you will only remember the win. Well said, Larsen, and well said, Levon Aronian. So that win meant that Aronian was equal at the top with Fabiano Caruana. But that wasn't the end of the story. Magnus Carlsen was still plugging away against Hikaru Nakamura with a tiny advantage. It was a typical Carlsen position. Check out the next video and you'll see what happened in that game.